Why did a queen who had everything seem to create so much unhappiness for her own children? What happens when a mother's grief turns into a lifetime of control over 9 sons and daughters? How could the grandmother of Europe raise a family whose members would one day lead opposing armies in a great war? And what secrets were so important that they had to be systematically erased from history by the Queen's own daughter? We think of the Victorian era as a time of progress and propriety. But for the children of Queen Victoria, life in the royal spotlight was often a private struggle, full of rules, expectations, and heartbreaking secrets that were never meant to be told. Number 17, why was the Empress of Germany forced to smuggle her own letters? The Empress Frederick of Germany died in 1901. She was Queen Victoria's eldest child. Her own son, the German Emperor Wilhelm II, had her home surrounded by soldiers. He wasn't there to protect her. He was there to seize her private papers. He was especially looking for her letters to her mother, Queen Victoria. She had written thousands of them over nearly 4 decades. For years, the Empress, known to her family as Vicky, had lived in fear of this moment. She had already made a secret plan. A loyal courtier, Frederick Ponsonby, was tasked with smuggling the precious letters back to England. He packed them into special traveling cases and got them out of Germany just in time. This final act of defiance was the culmination of a lifetime of conflict. Vicky was brilliant. She was her father, Prince Albert's favorite child. He had personally overseen her education. He taught her about constitutional monarchy, liberalism, and progress. He believed she could bring these modern British ideas to Germany. In 1858, at just 17 years old, she married Prince Frederick of Prussia. She was full of hope. She thought she could help unify and liberalize her new country, but she was wrong. The Prussian court was not like the British one. It was conservative, militaristic, and deeply suspicious of outsiders. Vicky was seen as a foreigner pushing unwelcome ideas. Powerful figures like the Iron Chancellor Otto von Bismarck saw her as a threat. He worked to isolate her and her husband. He blocked their influence. Vicky wrote constantly to her mother, pouring out her frustrations. Her letters were her only lifeline. She felt like a stranger in her own home. She complained about the strict court etiquette, the political intrigues, and the constant criticism. Her relationship with her own children was also difficult. Her firstborn son, Wilhelm, was born with a damaged arm after a traumatic birth. The doctors of the time used brutal methods to try and fix it. This left Wilhelm with a lifelong physical disability and, some historians believe, deep psychological scars. He grew to resent his mother's Englishness. He embraced the rigid military culture of Prussia that she so disliked. This created a huge rift between them. When her husband Frederick finally became emperor in 1888, he was already suffering from terminal throat cancer. He reigned for only 99 days. His death left Vicky completely vulnerable. Her son, now Kaiser Wilhelm II, was in charge. She became a prisoner of her son's suspicion. He believed her letters contained state secrets or criticisms of Germany that could be used against him. He wanted to control her legacy. Vicky knew the letters were more than just personal correspondence. They were a historical record. They told the story of her struggles, her political hopes, and the deep, often difficult relationship between the British and German royal families. She called the plan to save them. A question of my whole life's work. The successful smuggling operation was her last victory. It ensured that her side of the story, full of disappointment and political isolation, would survive. The letters are now stored in the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle, a vast collection that reveals the private pain behind the public facade of a royal princess. Number 16, did Victoria really blame her son for her husband's death? Prince Albert died on December 14th, 1861. He was only 42. The official cause of death was typhoid fever. But for the rest of her long life, Queen Victoria believed the real cause was a broken heart, and she believed her eldest son, Albert Edward, or Bertie, was the one who broke it. She never truly forgave him. This accusation haunted Bertie, the future King Edward VII, for 40 years. It shaped his life and his relationship with his mother in profound ways. The trouble started a few weeks before Albert's death. Bertie, then 20 years old, was a student at Cambridge University. He was also undergoing army training. During this time, some of his fellow officers arranged for a young actress named Nellie Clifton to be smuggled into his quarters. It was a brief affair, a common folly for a young man of his class. But this was the Prince of Wales. Word got back to his parents. Prince Albert was devastated. He saw it as a moral failure of the highest order. He wrote to his son full of disappointment. In late November 1861, Albert, who was already feeling unwell, traveled to Cambridge to confront Bertie in person. They took a long walk in the cold rain. Albert lectured his son on his duty and his behavior. It was a serious emotional confrontation. Bertie was full of remorse. A few days after this meeting, Albert's health took a sharp turn for the worse. He was diagnosed with typhoid. His condition declined rapidly. Victoria was by his side, but the doctors could do nothing. When he died, Victoria's world collapsed. Her grief was absolute. In her sorrow, she needed someone to blame. She fixated on Bertie's transgression and a stressful trip to Cambridge. She wrote to her eldest daughter, Vicky, "I never can or shall look at him without a shudder." She told everyone that the dreadful business with Bertie had shattered Albert's nerves and left him unable to fight the illness. For Victoria, the connection was direct and undeniable. Albert had died of shame and worry over his son. This belief had severe consequences for Bertie. His grieving mother excluded him almost completely from state affairs. She believed he was too irresponsible and frivolous to be trusted with any real power. He was the heir to the throne, but he was given no meaningful role in the government. This pushed him further into a life of pleasure-seeking. He became the leader of a fast-living social circle, indulging in gambling, fine food, and romantic entanglements. It was the very lifestyle his mother condemned. Their relationship became a long, cold war. She controlled his life from a distance, criticizing his choices and refusing to see him as a capable adult. He, in turn, resented her for the blame she placed on him and the trust she denied him. It was only when Victoria died in 1901 that Bertie, at the age of 59, was finally able to become the king he had been waiting to be his entire life. But the shadow of his father's death and his mother's accusation never fully disappeared. Number 15. How did one princess unknowingly carry a curse to a doomed empire? Princess Alice was Queen Victoria's third child and second daughter. She was known for her compassion. When her father, Prince Albert, was dying, she nursed him tirelessly. Her empathy defined her life, but it was a hidden element in her genetic makeup that would have the most far-reaching consequences. Alice was a carrier of hemophilia. This genetic condition prevents blood from clotting properly. A small cut or bruise could be a life-threatening event. In the 19th century, there was no treatment. Alice passed this condition on to her children, and through one of her daughters, it reached the heart of the Russian Empire, contributing to its eventual collapse. Alice married Prince Louis of Hesse, a small German state, in 1862. The wedding took place shortly after her father's death and was a somber affair. Victoria said it was more of a funeral than a wedding. Alice and Louis had 7 children. The first sign of the royal disease, as it became known, appeared in their son, Prince Friedrich, nicknamed Fritty. In 1873, at the age of 2, Fritty fell from a window in their palace. It was a relatively short fall, and he might have survived. But he was a hemophiliac, he suffered a brain hemorrhage, and died hours later. Alice was heartbroken. She never fully recovered from the shock and guilt. The real historical impact came from one of her daughters, Alix. In 1894, Alix married the heir to the Russian throne, Nicholas II. She became Empress Alexandra Feodorovna. Like her mother, Alexandra was a carrier of hemophilia. She was deeply in love with her husband, but she was shy and unpopular at the Russian court. She was desperate to provide a male heir to secure the Romanov dynasty. After giving birth to 4 daughters, she finally had a son, Alexei, in 1904. The joy was short-lived. Soon it became clear that Alexei had inherited hemophilia. The Empress's world now revolved around her son's fragile health. Every fall, every nosebleed was a source of terror. The doctors were powerless. This desperation made Alexandra vulnerable. She turned to a Siberian mystic named Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin seemed to have a mysterious ability to calm Alexei and stop his bleeding episodes. Whether through hypnotism, prayer, or simple folk remedies, he gained the Empress's complete trust. She believed he was a holy man sent by God to save her son. Rasputin's influence grew enormous. Through Alexandra, he had the ear of the Tsar. He began to meddle in politics, securing appointments for his allies and dismissing his enemies. This caused a massive scandal. The Russian public and the aristocracy were outraged. They saw Rasputin as a corrupt and debauched peasant who had a strange hold over the imperial family. This undermined the authority of the Tsar at a critical time. Russia was struggling with social unrest and the immense pressures of the First World War. The scandal surrounding Rasputin, all stemming from Alexandra's desperate attempt to manage her son's inherited disease, eroded public trust in the monarchy. It was one of the key factors that created the conditions for the Russian Revolution of 1917, which brought the Romanov dynasty to its tragic end. All of it could be traced back to a genetic flaw carried quietly by a compassionate English princess. Number 14, what drove a royal duke to an early and mysterious grave. Prince Alfred, Queen Victoria's second son, seemed to have a promising future. He was known as Afy to his family. He entered the Royal Navy as a teenager and had a successful career, rising through the ranks. He was also a talented musician. In 1893, he inherited a German duchy from his uncle and became the reigning Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. But behind this respectable exterior, Afy was a deeply troubled man. He struggled with alcoholism, and his life ended in sadness and scandal. The worst part was the death of his only son, also named Alfred, which remains shrouded in mystery. Afy's marriage was not a happy one. He married the Grand Duchess Marie Alexandrovna of Russia, the only daughter of Tsar Alexander II. She was proud and imperious. She was used to the splendor of the Russian court and looked down on the more restrained British monarchy. She famously insisted on being addressed as Your Imperial Highness because it outranked Afy's Your Royal Highness. There was constant friction between her and the rest of the British royal family. The marriage was a political match, and it lacked warmth and affection. Afy found his escape in the Navy and, increasingly, in alcohol. He was known to drink heavily. This strained his marriage and his health. When he became the Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, his problems worsened. He was an English prince ruling a German state. His subjects saw him as a foreigner. He felt isolated and out of place. He spent less and less time in Coburg, preferring his homes in London or the French Riviera. The greatest tragedy of his life was his son, young Alfred. The young prince was sensitive and intelligent, but he lived a dissolute life. He was involved in several scandals and had a difficult relationship with his parents. In January 1899, during his parents' 25th wedding anniversary celebrations in Coburg, young Alfred reportedly shot himself. The exact circumstances are unclear. The court put out a story that he was suffering from a chronic ailment. To avoid a public scandal, his mother, the Grand Duchess Marie, refused to let him be treated in a hospital in Coburg. Instead, she had him sent to a sanatorium in the Austrian Alps. The journey was too much for him. He died there in early February, just 24 years old. The official cause of death was listed as consumption or tuberculosis, but few believed it. The rumors of a self-inflicted wound persisted. His parents were devastated, but their grief was mixed with the shame of the scandal they had tried so hard to cover up. Afy never recovered from the loss of his heir. His own health, already damaged by years of heavy drinking, declined rapidly. He died just a year and a half later, in July 1900, from throat cancer. His reign in Coburg, which had begun with so much dynastic promise, ended in personal tragedy and public whispers. The story of the troubled Duke and his son's mysterious death was one of the darkest chapters in the family's history. Number 13 was Princess Helena, a devoted daughter, or a royal prisoner. Princess Helena was Queen Victoria's fifth child. She was not considered the prettiest or the most talented of the sisters. She was plain, stout, and sensible. Her family called her Lenchen. While her sisters married foreign princes and moved abroad, Helena's life took a very different path. She became her mother's unofficial secretary and companion. Victoria arranged a marriage for her that ensured she would never leave England or indeed ever be far from her mother's side. For Helena, a life of duty also became a life of confinement. After Prince Albert's death, Queen Victoria relied heavily on her daughters. Princess Alice served this role first, but when she married and moved to Germany, the queen needed a replacement. The task fell to Helena. She was organized and capable. She helped her mother with her massive correspondence, transcribing letters, and managing state papers. She was a constant, steady presence for the grieving queen, but Victoria's need for her daughter went beyond simple assistance. She wanted to keep Helena close. When it came time for Helena to marry, Victoria had strict conditions. She searched for a husband who was royal enough, but not so important that he would take her daughter away. She found Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein. He was a German prince, but he was 15 years older than Helena and had no real prospects or fortune. His main appeal was his willingness to live in England. Victoria made it a condition of the marriage. The couple was given rooms at Windsor Castle and a nearby home, Cumberland Lodge. Helena was married, but she was not free. She remained on call for her mother day and night. Helena's life was one of quiet service. She was involved in many charities, particularly nursing. She was a founder of the Royal British Nurses Association, but her personal life was filled with quiet struggles. Her marriage to Prince Christian was respectful but not passionate. They had several children, but 2 of their sons died young, a source of immense grief. Helena herself suffered from poor health. She had rheumatism and joint pain. To manage the pain, she was prescribed laudanum, a tincture of opium and alcohol. And it was a common painkiller in the Victorian era, but it was also highly addictive. Many historians believe that Helena developed a dependency on the drug, a secret burden she carried for years. She remained in her mother's service until the very end. She was there when Victoria died in 1901. Helena had spent nearly 40 years as her mother's helper. She had sacrificed her independence for a life of duty. While her sisters ran royal courts in other countries, Helena ran errands at Windsor. She was a dutiful daughter, and in many ways she was a prisoner of that duty. Her story is a quiet one, lacking the high drama of her siblings. But it reveals a different kind of darkness, the slow erosion of a life lived entirely in someone else's shadow. Number 12, did the Queen's most rebellious daughter hide the biggest secret of all? Princess Louise was Queen Victoria's 6th child and 4th daughter. She was the opposite of her sensible sister Helena. Louise was artistic, unconventional, and fiercely independent. She was a talented sculptor and painter. She supported the suffragist movement for women's right to vote, a radical idea for a princess. She smoked in public. She refused to be just another pawn in the royal marriage game. Her life was filled with rumors of secret romances and a defiant spirit. The most persistent rumor, one that has never been fully proven or disproven, is that she gave birth to a secret child before she was married. And Louise was known as the most beautiful of Victoria's daughters. She was also the most rebellious. She chafed under the strict rules of her mother's court. She wanted a life of her own. She was determined to marry for love, or at least for companionship. She rejected a series of royal suitors. Instead, she chose to marry a British nobleman, John Campbell, the Marquess of Lorne. He was the heir to the Duke of Argyll. Marrying a subject, even a high-ranking one, was a shocking break with royal tradition. Queen Victoria eventually agreed, perhaps seeing it as a way to bring some new life into the monarchy. The marriage took place in 1871. The marriage, however, was not happy. Lorne was rumored to be more interested in the company of men. The couple spent long periods apart. They had no children. This lack of an heir only fueled the speculation about Louise's past. The story of a secret child centers on the son of Sir Charles Lowcock, Queen Victoria's obstetrician. The Lowcock family adopted a boy named Henry in 1867. The family story, passed down through generations, is that Henry was actually Princess Louise's illegitimate son. The father was supposedly Walter Sterling, a tutor to her younger brother, Prince Leopold. The theory goes that Louise had a secret romance, became pregnant, and her family arranged for a quiet birth and a discreet adoption with a trusted doctor to avoid a massive royal scandal. There is no definitive proof. No birth certificate or confession has ever been found. But there are intriguing clues. Louise took a special interest in the Lowcock family throughout her life. Henry Lowcock's descendants have pointed to family resemblances and circumstantial evidence. But without DNA testing, which the royal family has never permitted, it remains a tantalizing mystery. Whether the story is true or not, it speaks to the kind of life Louise led. She was a woman who lived on her own terms as much as possible. When her husband was appointed Governor General of Canada, she went with him. She was popular there, but she had a serious sleighing accident that left her with lasting injuries. After returning to Britain, she and her husband lived mostly separate lives. She moved in artistic and literary circles. She had a studio at Kensington Palace. She remained an enigmatic figure, fiercely protective of her privacy. In her old age, she became something of a recluse. She ordered all of her personal papers to be destroyed after her death. Princess Louise took her secrets with her to the grave, leaving behind a legacy of rebellion and one of the most enduring mysteries of the Victorian royal family. Number 11. Why was being the perfect son such a heavy burden? Prince Arthur was Queen Victoria's 7th child and 3rd son. He was said to be her favorite. He was born on the birthday of his great hero, the Duke of Wellington, who was also his godfather. From a young age, Arthur was obedient, dutiful, and well-behaved. He never caused the kind of scandals that his older brother Bertie did. He chose a military career, just as his father Prince Albert would have wanted. He seemed to be the model prince, the one child who never disappointed his mother. But the pressure of being perfect, of living up to everyone's expectations, was its own kind of prison. Victoria doted on Arthur. She wrote that he was dearer than any of the others to her. After Albert's death, she clung to the children who reminded her of him. Arthur, with his serious demeanor and sense of duty, was the living embodiment of his father's virtues. The Queen took an intense interest in every aspect of his life. She controlled his education, his military postings, and his social life. While this came from a place of love, it was also stifling. Arthur had very little freedom to make his own choices. He was destined for the army. It was a path chosen for him, not by him, but he took to it with professionalism. He served all over the British Empire, in Canada, India, and South Africa. He was a competent soldier and a popular public figure. He was the steady, reliable son. In 1879, he married Princess Louise Margaret of Prussia. It was a happy marriage, unlike those of so many of his siblings. They had 3 children. On the surface, his life was a complete success, but the weight of being the good son took its toll. He was always in the shadow of his older brother, the heir. He had responsibility, but little real power. His mother's constant oversight meant he was never truly his own man. The burden was not just his to bear. His wife, Princess Louise Margaret, also struggled. She was known to be shy and unhappy with the constant demands of public life. In her later years, her health declined, and she suffered from periods of mental distress. Life in the royal spotlight was a strain for her. Arthur's career culminated in his appointment as Governor General of Canada in 1911. He was the first member of the royal family to hold the post. He was there during the First World War, a difficult time for the country. It was also a time of immense personal pain for him. He was a British field marshal, but his family ties were German. His wife was German. His favorite daughter, Margaret, was the Crown Princess of Sweden, but his other daughter, Patricia, had a name that was proudly British. He had nephews and cousins fighting on both sides of the conflict. The war tore his extended family apart. The perfect life he had built, based on duty to crown and family, was fractured by the reality of a world at war. He carried out his duties with his usual stoicism, but the personal cost was immense. He lived a long life, dying in 1942, a relic of a bygone era. He had been the model son, but the price of that perfection was a life lived under constant control and immense pressure. Number 10, what was it like to live every day in fear of a simple cut? Here, Prince Leopold was Queen Victoria's 8th child and youngest son. He was born with hemophilia, the same genetic condition that his sister Alice carried. But for Leopold, it was not a hidden trait. It was a daily reality. From his earliest childhood, he lived with the knowledge that any small injury could be fatal. A bump, a fall, or a nosebleed could trigger uncontrollable bleeding. His life was a constant battle between his sharp, active mind and his fragile body. He lived in a gilded cage, protected and monitored at all times, desperate for a normal life that was forever out of reach. Victoria was fiercely protective of Leopold. She had already lost her husband. The thought of losing a child to an incurable disease terrified her. She smothered him with caution. He was not allowed to play rough games like his brothers. His tutors were given strict instructions to prevent any accidents. He was often confined indoors for his own safety. This overprotection was frustrating for Leopold. He was highly intelligent and curious. He loved art, music, and literature. He wanted to go to university and have a meaningful career. His mother resisted. She was afraid the risks would be too great. Leopold fought for his independence. He eventually persuaded the Queen to let him attend Christ Church, Oxford. He thrived in the academic environment. He made friends and engaged in intellectual debates. It was the first real taste of freedom he had ever had. After Oxford, he wanted a role in public life. He served as his mother's private secretary for a time, but he wanted more. He wanted to be a governor general in a colony like Canada or Australia, just like his brother-in-law. Victoria refused. The risk was too high. He was trapped by his condition and by his mother's fear. He also longed for a family of his own. Finding a wife was difficult. Many royal families were aware of the bleeding disease in the British royal family and were hesitant to marry their daughters to him. But Leopold was charming and intelligent. He eventually won the hand of Princess Helena of Waldeck and Pyrmont. They married in 1882. For a brief time, Leopold was happy. He had a wife he adored and a daughter named Alice. A second child was on the way, but his happiness was fragile. In early 1884, Leopold's doctors advised him to go to the south of France for the winter to escape the damp English climate. While staying in Cannes, he slipped and fell on a staircase. He seemed to be fine at first. He had injured his knee and bumped his head. But overnight, the internal bleeding started. He died the next morning from a cerebral hemorrhage. He was only 30 years old. His son, Charles Edward, was born 4 months after his death. Leopold's short life was a testament to his courage and his determination to live as fully as possible. But it was also a tragic illustration of the constant looming threat that hung over him every single day. Number 9. Did Princess Beatrice sacrifice her entire life for her mother? Princess Beatrice was the last of Queen Victoria's 9 children. She was born in 1857, just 4 years before Prince Albert's death. From her earliest days, her role was decided for her. She was to be her mother's companion. Victoria called her baby well into her adult years. As her other children grew up, married, and moved away, the Queen's grip on her youngest daughter tightened. Beatrice was not expected to leave. She was expected to dedicate her life to her mother. It was a life of service that came at the cost of her own freedom. Victoria's grief after Albert's death was all-consuming. She withdrew from public life. She relied on her children for emotional support. Beatrice, being the youngest, bore the brunt of this need. She was her mother's constant shadow, her secretary, her reader, and her confidante. The Queen made it clear that she expected Beatrice to remain unmarried. She could not bear to lose her last companion. She once wrote, "The idea of her marrying is to me a misery. Beatrice grew up knowing that her primary purpose was to care for her mother." But Beatrice fell in love. At a wedding, she met the handsome Prince Henry of Battenberg. They wanted to marry. When Beatrice told her mother, the Queen was furious. She refused to speak to Beatrice for several months. They communicated only by written notes. The silence and the disapproval were a heavy emotional burden for Beatrice. She was torn between her love for Prince Henry and her duty to her mother. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The Queen would only consent to the marriage on one condition: Beatrice and Henry had to live with her, and they would never have a home of their own. Henry had to give up his German military career and become a permanent resident of the Queen's household. It was a huge sacrifice, but it was the only way. They married in 1885. Beatrice was 28. For a time, she had a taste of happiness. She and Henry, whom the family called Lyco, had 4 children, but they were always under Victoria's roof, their lives dictated by the Queen's schedule, and Henry grew tired of the quiet, constrained life at court. He wanted to do something meaningful. He pleaded with the Queen to let him undertake military service. He eventually got his wish. He joined an expedition to fight in the Anglo-Asante War in West Africa in 1895. Beatrice was terrified. Her fears were realized. Henry didn't die in battle. He contracted malaria. He died on the journey home in January 1896. Beatrice was a widow at 38. Her world was shattered. After Henry's death, she threw herself back into her old role. She was once again her mother's full-time companion. When Victoria died in 1901, she left Beatrice with one final, monumental task. She was to be her mother's literary executor. Victoria had kept a detailed journal for most of her life, filling 122 volumes. Beatrice was instructed to edit the journals for publication, but she did more than edit. She spent the next 30 years transcribing the journals, but she censored them heavily. She removed anything she thought was too personal, too critical, or that might damage her mother's reputation. After she finished each volume, she destroyed the original. The result is that the Queen Victoria's journals we have today are not her own words, but her daughter's carefully curated version of them. Beatrice had spent her youth as her mother's companion, and her later years as the guardian of her mother's memory. Her entire life was defined by one person, her mother, the Queen. Number 8. Why did the Queen insist on meddling in her children's nurseries? Queen Victoria and Prince Albert presented a public image of the ideal family. They had 9 children and seemed to embody domestic bliss. But behind the scenes, Victoria had a very complicated and often negative view of pregnancy, childbirth, and babies. She found the physical aspects of motherhood distasteful. This personal discomfort, combined with her powerful need for control, led her to meddle extensively in the lives of her children, especially when it came to how they raised their own. Her control reached right into their nurseries. Victoria hated being pregnant. She called it the shadow side of marriage. She referred to newborn babies as ugly, frog-like creatures. While she loved her children deeply as they grew, the infant stage held no joy for her. She was also one of the first women in Europe to use chloroform as an anesthetic during childbirth, a practice that was considered controversial and even immoral by some at the time. She used it for the births of her last 2 children, Leopold and Beatrice. She championed its use, which helped to make it more acceptable. This detached and clinical view of childbirth and infancy shaped her role as a grandmother. She was the grandmother of Europe, with dozens of grandchildren spread across the continent. She took an intense interest in their upbringing, but her interest was often critical and controlling. She dispatched letters to her daughters with detailed, unsolicited advice on everything from feeding schedules to clothing. She was a strong believer in strict, regimented childcare, a hallmark of the Victorian era. She believed children should be disciplined and not coddled. Her interference was most pronounced with her eldest daughter, Vicky. When Vicky had her first child, the future Kaiser Wilhelm II, Victoria sent a stream of letters to Berlin. She dictated who should be hired as a wet nurse. She insisted on certain types of clothing. She criticized Vicky's mothering skills. This created enormous tension. Vicky was trying to adapt to a new life in a foreign court, and her mother's constant stream of commands and criticisms made it much harder. Victoria seemed to believe that only she knew the correct way to raise a royal child. She was also very concerned with the health and physical appearance of her grandchildren. She was anxious about the spread of hemophilia in the family. She was critical of grandchildren she considered plain or unwell. Her letters are full of frank and often harsh assessments of the young children. This constant judgment put her daughters under immense pressure. They were not just raising children, they were raising potential heirs who had to meet the Queen's exacting standards. Victoria's meddling was a way for her to maintain control over a family that was spreading across Europe. Her children were marrying into the ruling houses of Germany, Russia, and other nations. By controlling the nurseries, she felt she could ensure that her grandchildren were raised with the right values, which to her were British values. But for her daughters who were trying to build their own families and navigate complex political situations, their mother's long-distance management was often a source of great stress and resentment. The queen's desire for control extended far beyond the walls of her own palace. Number 7. How did royal marriages become a game of political chess? For Queen Victoria's children, marriage was rarely about love. It was about duty. It was a tool of statecraft. Victoria and Albert had a grand vision. They wanted to create a network of family ties that would link Britain with the other great powers of Europe. They hoped this network would promote peace and stability. They strategically arranged the marriages of their 9 children to princes and princesses from across the continent. Their children became pawns in a great dynastic game of chess, but this grand plan had unintended consequences. It created intense family rivalries, and instead of preventing war, it ensured that the great conflict of the 20th century would be a family affair. The first move in this game was the marriage of Vicky, the Princess Royal, to Prince Frederick of Prussia in 1858. The idea was that Vicky, with her liberal British education, would influence the future of a unified Germany. It was a move designed to create a powerful Anglo-German alliance, but as we've seen, it didn't work out that way. And Vicky was isolated, and her son Wilhelm grew to resent his English heritage. The other marriages followed a similar pattern of political calculation. Princess Alice married into the German House of Hesse. Prince Alfred married the only daughter of the Russian Tsar, a key strategic alliance. Prince Arthur married a Prussian princess. The daughters of the Prince of Wales, Bertie, married into the royal families of Norway and Denmark. Victoria's grandchildren continued the pattern, marrying into the royal houses of Spain, Romania, Greece, and Sweden. By the early 1900s, the Queen's descendants were on the thrones, or married to the heirs of the thrones of nearly every major European monarchy. This created a tangled web of relationships. The family gatherings were like summits of European royalty, but shared blood did not guarantee shared political interests. In fact, it often made things worse. Family jealousies and personal dislikes became entangled with international diplomacy. The most famous example is the rivalry between 3 of Victoria's grandsons, King George V of Britain, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, whose wife was Victoria's granddaughter. These 3 cousins controlled the fate of Europe in the years leading up to 1914. Their personal relationship was strained. Wilhelm, in particular, had a complicated love-hate relationship with Britain. He admired its navy and its empire, but he also felt patronized and underestimated by his British relatives. He and his uncle, Bertie King Edward VII, had a notoriously bad relationship. Bertie saw Wilhelm as a bombastic and unstable warmonger. Wilhelm saw Bertie as a decadent old fool who was trying to encircle Germany with hostile alliances. Their personal animosity poisoned diplomatic relations. When the First World War broke out in 1914, it was literally a family at war with itself. King George V was fighting his first cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II. On the other side of the conflict, Tsar Nicholas II was also fighting his German cousin, even though both he and his wife were close relatives of the British royal family. Victoria's grand dream of family unity had devolved into a catastrophic global conflict. The very marriages that were meant to secure peace had created a situation where international disputes were also bitter, personal family squabbles. The game of royal chess had ended in a devastating stalemate. Number 6. What happened when the Queen's grandchildren ruled rival empires? By the early 20th century, Queen Victoria's vision of a family-run Europe had become a reality. Her grandchildren occupied some of the most powerful positions in the world. But this reality was far from the peaceful utopia she had imagined. The personal dynamics between these royal cousins, particularly George V of Great Britain, Wilhelm II of Germany, and Nicholas II of Russia, played a significant role in the escalating tensions that led to the First World War. Their shared heritage did not create a bond of understanding. Instead, it created a toxic mix of rivalry, jealousy, and misunderstanding that had global consequences. Kaiser Wilhelm II was the most complex and volatile of the 3. He was Victoria's first grandchild. He was half English, and his mother, Vicky, had tried to raise him with British liberal values, but he rejected this heritage. He embraced the militarism of his Prussian father's family. He had a deep-seated insecurity, partly stemming from his withered arm, a birth defect he tried to hide his whole life. This insecurity manifested as arrogance and a desire to prove Germany's strength, particularly its naval strength, in direct competition with Britain. His letters and conversations with his British and Russian relatives were often erratic, swinging between professions of friendship and veiled threats. He felt that his grandmama Victoria had always favored his uncles and cousins over him. King George V of Great Britain was a very different character. He was quiet, conservative, and dutiful. He was a naval man, like his cousin Wilhelm. But he had none of the Kaiser's flamboyance. He was not a brilliant intellectual, but he had a strong sense of duty and a deep love for his country. He found his German cousins' posturing and theatrical behavior tiresome and dangerous. Their physical resemblance was striking. When seen together in similar military uniforms, they could be mistaken for brothers, but their personalities and their political outlooks could not have been more different. George represented the stability of a constitutional monarchy, while Wilhelm embodied the aggressive ambition of a new and powerful empire. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia was, in many ways, the most tragic figure. He was a devoted family man, but a weak and indecisive ruler. He was married to Victoria's granddaughter Alexandra, which made him doubly connected to the family. He was a gentle soul, ill-suited to rule a vast and turbulent empire. He was easily influenced first by his advisors and later disastrously by his wife and Rasputin. He and George V were very close. They looked so much alike that at a wedding their own relatives confused them. They corresponded affectionately, calling each other Georgie and Nicky. Nicholas felt much more comfortable with his calm English cousin than with his bombastic German one. The family ties became a liability. Diplomatic cables were replaced by personal letters between Willie, Georgie, and Nicky. But this familiarity did not help. It led to misunderstandings. Wilhelm would write blustering letters to Nicholas, trying to pull him away from his alliance with France and Britain. Nicholas would often give vague, polite replies that Wilhelm would misinterpret. When the crisis of July 1914 began, a series of desperate telegrams flew between the cousins. The Willie-Nicky telegrams show them trying to pull back from the brink, but it was too late. The military machines they commanded were already in motion. The personal pleas of cousins were no match for the forces of nationalism, imperialism, and military alliances that they themselves had helped to build. The war destroyed the world they knew. For Nicholas, it led to the end of his dynasty. For Wilhelm, it meant abdication and exile. Only George V survived, but his family's name was changed from the German Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the very English Windsor, a symbolic severing of the family ties that had once defined European royalty. Number 5. Why was the Queen's second son so deeply unpopular in his own kingdom? When Prince Alfred Affi became the reigning Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in 1893, it should have been the crowning achievement of his life. He was now a sovereign ruler, no longer just the second son of the British monarch, but the reality was a bitter disappointment. Affi was deeply unpopular with his German subjects. He was seen as an outsider, hard-drinking Englishman who had little interest in his new responsibilities. His reign was marked by absenteeism, public discontent, and personal tragedy. The story of Duke Alfred shows how the grand dynastic plan of Victoria and Albert could fail on a very personal level. The Duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was the ancestral home of Prince Albert. It was a small but significant German state. When Albert's brother, Duke Ernst II, died childless, the title passed to his next of kin. The Prince of Wales, Bertie, was the rightful heir, but he renounced his claim. He could not be heir to the British throne, and a reigning German duke at the same time. So the duchy passed to the next brother, Alfred. From the start, it was an awkward fit. Affi had spent his entire life in the British Royal Navy. His home was in London. His entire identity was British. The people of Coburg were not impressed with their new ruler. He spoke German with a heavy English accent. He showed little interest in the local culture or politics. He spent as much time as possible away from Coburg, preferring to live at Clarence House in London or his villa in the south of France. This absenteeism was a major source of resentment. His subjects felt neglected. They had a duke who was rarely there and seemed to care little for them. His wife, the Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna, did not help matters. As the daughter of a Russian czar, she was famously proud and aloof. She looked down on the provincial society of Coburg. She made little effort to connect with the local people. The ducal couple remained isolated in their palace, surrounded by their own English and Russian staff. They did not endear themselves to the local aristocracy or the general population. Afy's personal habits also became a problem. His heavy drinking was not a secret. It affected his health and his ability to govern. There were financial issues as well. The duchy was not as wealthy as he had hoped, and his lavish lifestyle created strain. The public mood soured. The Duke, who was meant to embody the close ties between Britain and Germany, instead became a symbol of foreign indifference. The tragic death of his son and heir, young Alfred, in 1899 was the final blow. The scandal surrounding his death further damaged the family's reputation. When Duke Alfred himself died just a year later, there was little public mourning in Coburg. The ducal title passed to his nephew, Charles Edward, the posthumous son of Prince Leopold. The reign of Queen Victoria's second son had been a failure. It demonstrated that simply placing a royal on a foreign throne was not enough. Without genuine commitment and a connection to the people, the arrangement was doomed. Number 4. How did a secret addiction haunt the royal halls? The Victorian era was a time of strict public morality. The royal family was expected to be a model of propriety and self-control. But behind the palace walls, some of Victoria's children struggled with private demons. One of the most hidden secrets was addiction. In an age before modern medicine understood dependency, common remedies could lead to a lifetime of struggle. Princess Helena, the queen's dutiful daughter, is believed to have become dependent on laudanum, a powerful opium-based painkiller. But she may not have been the only one. The pressures and pains of royal life, both physical and psychological, led some family members down a dark path. Laudanum was the all-purpose medicine of the 19th century. It was a mixture of opium and alcohol, and it was available over the counter. It was used to treat everything from coughs and colds to anxiety and severe pain. It was also incredibly addictive. Many respectable men and women, from writers to housewives, became unknowingly hooked on their daily dose of medicine. Princess Helena, or Lenchen, suffered from chronic rheumatism and severe joint pain for much of her adult life. It was a debilitating condition that made movement difficult. To manage the pain, her doctors prescribed laudanum. It is very likely that over years of use, she developed a physical and psychological dependence on the drug. It was a quiet, private struggle. Outwardly, she was the picture of Victorian duty, a devoted wife, mother, and charitable worker. But inwardly, she may have been battling a secret addiction. This was not seen as a moral failing at the time, but rather as an unfortunate consequence of medical treatment. Still, it would have been a closely guarded secret, a source of private shame in a family that valued strength and decorum above all else. Other members of the family also had their vices. Prince Alfred's struggle with alcoholism was well known. His heavy drinking damaged his health and his reputation, especially during his time as the ruler of Coburg. It was a more visible and more socially disruptive addiction than Helena's quiet laudanum use, but it came from a similar place of unhappiness and a desire to escape. Even the Prince of Wales, Bertie, lived a life of excess that bordered on addiction. He was a compulsive pleasure seeker. He was a notorious gourmand, eating massive meals that led to serious weight problems. He was an avid gambler, and he was a chain smoker, known to smoke a dozen large cigars and over 20 cigarettes a day. While this was seen as part of his playboy persona, today we would recognize it as a pattern of compulsive behavior. It was his way of coping with the boredom and frustration of being a 40-year-old heir with no real job. These struggles were hidden from the public. The image of the royal family was carefully managed. They were meant to be symbols of stability and virtue. But the reality was that they were human beings, subject to the same pains and weaknesses as anyone else. The secret of addiction in the royal halls is a reminder that the perfect Victorian facade often concealed deep personal turmoil. The pressure to be perfect, the pain of chronic illness, and the emptiness of a life without purpose could lead even a prince or princess into a hidden world of dependency. Number 3, What was the true price of being Grandmama of Europe? Queen Victoria earned the nickname the Grandmother of Europe for a reason. By the end of her life, she had 42 grandchildren. Her descendants were spread across the continent, from the shores of the Baltic to the Mediterranean. On the surface, this was a great dynastic success. Victoria had created a family empire, but managing this vast and complex network of relatives came at a huge personal and political cost. The Queen spent her later years, not just as a monarch, but as a matriarch, trying to control, advise, and sometimes scold a sprawling and often quarreling family. The price of this role was constant anxiety and the slow unraveling of her dream of a peaceful family-led Europe. Her primary tool of management was the letter. Victoria was a prodigious letter writer. Every day, couriers would leave Windsor carrying pouches filled with her distinctive black-bordered stationery. She wrote to her children and grandchildren constantly. These letters were a mix of family gossip, political advice, and stern commands. She wanted to know everything: who was marrying whom, how the babies were being raised, what the political situation was in Berlin or St. Petersburg. She offered her opinions on everything, whether they were wanted or not. This created a huge burden for her and for her family. Her daughter Beatrice acted as her full-time secretary, helping her to manage this massive flow of correspondence. For her children and grandchildren, ruling in foreign courts, a letter from Grandmama could be a mixed blessing. It was a sign of her affection, but it could also be a source of pressure. Vicky in Germany often felt caught between her duty to her mother and her loyalty to her new country. The Queen's letters were often critical of German policy, putting Vicky in an impossible position. Victoria also tried to act as a family peacemaker, but her interventions often failed. She tried to soothe the rivalry between her grandson Wilhelm II and her son Bertie, but she had little success. Her personal biases were often clear. She was fond of her Hessian grandchildren, but had a difficult relationship with her Russian relatives by marriage. These personal feelings inevitably colored her political views. She saw international relations through the lens of family dynamics. She would speak of Willie's latest outburst or Nikki's weakness, reducing complex geopolitical issues to family squabbles. The sheer scale of the family made it impossible to control. As the grandchildren grew up and had children of their own, the network became ever more tangled. The political interests of a grandchild in Romania might conflict with one in Greece. The Queen tried to keep track of it all, but she was fighting a losing battle against the rising tides of nationalism and political change. Her vision of a Europe held together by family bonds was an old-fashioned 18th century idea that was becoming obsolete in the new, more aggressive world of the late 19th century. In her final years, the Queen must have felt a sense of foreboding. The tensions between her relatives were growing. The political climate in Europe was becoming more hostile. The South African Boer War brought Britain into conflict with the sympathies of many of her German relatives. Her grand family project, which she had poured so much energy into, was showing deep cracks. The true price of being the grandmother of Europe was the slow, heartbreaking realization that blood is not always thicker than water, and that even her immense authority could not stop her own family from heading towards a collision. Number 2, why did the Queen's eldest daughter feel like a spy in her own home? Princess Victoria, or Vicky, was perhaps the most tragic of all the Queen's children. She was intelligent, liberal, and devoted to the memory of her father, Prince Albert. When she married the heir to the Prussian throne, she was sent to Germany with a mission to bring British-style constitutional monarchy to the heart of Europe. But from the moment she arrived, she was treated with suspicion. She was seen not as a German princess, but as a foreign agent. For over 40 years, she felt like a spy in her own home, caught in a lonely battle between her British upbringing and her Prussian duties. The Prussian court was a world away from the relative freedom of Windsor. It was rigid, militaristic, and deeply conservative. Vicky's liberal ideas were seen as dangerous. Her intelligence was considered unfeminine. Her love for her home country was interpreted as disloyalty. The powerful Chancellor Otto von Bismarck was her chief adversary. He saw her and her husband, Crown Prince Frederick, as obstacles to his plan for a Germany dominated by authoritarian Prussian rule. He worked systematically to isolate them from power and influence. Vicky's main link to her old life was her mother. They wrote to each other several times a week. In these thousands of letters, Vicky poured out her heart. She described her loneliness, her frustration with the court, and her political struggles. She sent her mother detailed reports on German politics, military plans, and the personalities at court. Queen Victoria, in turn, used this information. She would share Vicky's insights with her ministers. In essence, Vicky was acting as an unofficial and very well-placed source of intelligence for the British government. This put her in an incredibly dangerous position. She knew that if her correspondence were ever intercepted, she would be accused of treason. She and her mother used codes and couriers to protect their letters. She was constantly afraid of being watched. She wrote of feeling that the walls had ears. She was an English woman in her heart, and she made little effort to hide it. She defended British policies and criticized Prussian militarism. This only deepened the suspicion around her. She was the English woman, a label that followed her for her entire life in Germany. Her relationship with her son, the future Kaiser Wilhelm II, was the ultimate source of her pain. Wilhelm rejected everything his mother stood for. He allied himself with Bismarck. He embraced an aggressive, anti-British form of German nationalism. He saw his mother's liberal values as weak, and her Englishness as a betrayal. This political and ideological gulf between mother and son was also a deep personal wound. When her husband finally became emperor in 1888, it was too late. He was already dying of cancer. After his 99-day reign, Vicky was left a widow, powerless and at the mercy of the son who despised her. As Empress Frederick, she lived her final years in isolation, watching as her son took Germany down a path that was the opposite of everything she and her father had hoped for. Her life was a long, lonely mission that ended in failure. She had tried to build a bridge between Britain and Germany, but she ended up stranded in the middle, trusted by neither side, a permanent exile in the country she was meant to rule. Number 1. What happened to the Queen's private thoughts after she died? Queen Victoria kept a journal for almost her entire life, from the age of 13 until just days before her death in 1901. These journals were her most private possession. They contained her uncensored thoughts on her family, on politics, on her grief for Albert, and on the daily events of her long reign. In total, she filled 122 volumes. They were a priceless historical record, a direct window into the mind of one of the most influential monarchs in history. But today, the original journals no longer exist. They were systematically destroyed. The person who destroyed them was her own daughter, Princess Beatrice. Beatrice was Victoria's youngest child, her constant companion and secretary. In her will, the Queen gave Beatrice the task of editing the journals for possible publication. The instructions were to remove anything that might be too personal or that could cause pain to living people. Beatrice took this instruction to an extreme. She decided that editing was not enough. She would create a new sanitized version of the journals and destroy the originals. For the next 30 years, from 1901 until the 1930s, Beatrice undertook this monumental task. She would sit down each day with one of her mother's original volumes and a blank notebook. She would read a passage from her mother's journal and then transcribe a version of it into the new book. But she was not just a transcriber, she was a censor. She cut out anything she deemed inappropriate. This included her mother's harsh criticisms of politicians, her brutally honest and often unflattering descriptions of family members, and any details that she felt were unseemly or undignified for a queen. What she removed is a matter of historical speculation. It's likely she cut passages where Victoria expressed her dislike for pregnancy and babies. She probably removed the Queen's most bitter complaints about her children, especially her early difficulties with Bertie. Any hints of scandal, family quarrels, or political indiscretions were almost certainly erased. Beatrice's goal was to protect her mother's image. She wanted to present Victoria to the world as a wise, benevolent, and almost saintly figure. She was shaping the official memory of the Victorian era, smoothing over all the rough edges. As she completed each new censored volume, she would take the original and burn it. Page by page, she destroyed her mother's true voice. It was an act of filial devotion, but it was also an act of historical vandalism on a massive scale. We will never know what secrets, what raw emotions, what unguarded thoughts were lost in the smoke of those fires. The journals that are available to historians today are not Victoria's journals. They are Beatrice's version of Victoria's journals. Beatrice believed she was doing her duty. She had spent her life serving her mother, and this was her final service to protect her mother's legacy. But in doing so, she robbed history of a priceless treasure. She ensured that the full, complex, and often difficult personality of Queen Victoria would be forever hidden behind a carefully constructed facade of respectability. The greatest secret of all was not what was in the journals, but what was taken out of them, and the fact that a daughter's love led to the destruction of her mother's true self.